If every feeble-minded woman should be faithfully segregated for 20 years, at least 50% of the feeble-mindedness would disappear. Feeble-mindedness is no less an evil than tuberculosis.
New York State say what?
The feeble-minded girl of 15, 16, or 17 years is, in body, a woman with the instincts and dangers of womanhood. But in mind, she is a child, no more responsible than her younger sister of 6 or 8 years. She is innocent, gentle, affectionate, confiding. She believes everything that is said to her. If any man tells her that she is the prettiest girl in town, she believes him.
What? What are you talking about?
She then becomes a source of corruption and disease to scores of young men, and she bears children, one after the other, who inherit her infirmities and entail similar afflictions.
Feeble-minded, source of corruption. What?
She is an incorrigible, a repeater, an enemy to society. She is cast out and despised by reputable women.
And make out a small beam of light against the mirror.
Truly weird stuff.
There was an unusual, even a little bit strange question on the 1840 United States Census. How many people in your household are idiots or insane? 17 million people were counted in that census. Of that number, 17,456 were characterized as insane and idiots. Weird, right? How the government was suddenly so interested in how many lunatics lived at your address. Can you imagine a doctor diagnosing you as a moron or an idiot? How about an imbecile? No? Would you be okay with feeble-minded then? Because believe it or not, out of that bunch, feeble-minded is definitely the way to go. It's the mildest of these afflictions, though if we're being honest, that doesn't much matter here. Here is the State Custodial Asylum for Feeble-Minded Women in Newark, New York. It was established in 1878, initially as an offshoot of the Syracuse State Institution for Feeble-Minded Children, which were plentiful enough back in the day to have created a problem. What to do with female inmates who'd aged out? Some were discharged, but many weren't. And these female inmates, it's hard to call them patients with a straight face once you know how the place worked. Well, they had to be housed somewhere. A social reformer named Josephine Shaw Lowell had expressed grave concerns about where such women might best be placed. She claimed that feeble-minded women had no regard for morality and were unable to practice sexual restraint, and so would bear illegitimate children who would then be a burden on the state. Is that what you want? She demanded. Oh, no, most definitely not, came the response. These women, aged 15 to 45, childbearing age, must, Josephine Shaw Lowell said, be prevented from producing more children of their own kind, which sounds very much like a eugenics-based strategy, because it very much was a eugenics-based strategy in all its who is fit to reproduce glory. And so, with the support of the New York Board of Charities, Lowell succeeded in getting the State Custodial Asylum for Feeble-Minded Women funded and built. Only women of childbearing age were admitted, and as soon as a woman hit menopause, she was bounced. The administrators were not even a little bit subtle about that mandate.
Commitments to the institution are made by the superintendents of the poor and also by judges of courts of record on blank forms prescribed by the institution. The purpose of the institution being to segregate women of the childbearing period. Every effort is made to make it as much a home as possible. It is conducted as an open institution, there being no locked doors and no fences.
Preventing women deemed undesirable from producing children. That was the mission. Dress it up however you like. Make up whatever diagnosis gets the job done. This adult offshoot of the Syracuse State Institution for Feeble-Minded Children proved to be such a roaring success that the New York State Legislature made it its own separate institution just 7 years later in 1885. These were the boom times in America for insane asylums, and that was due in large part to that weird question on the 1840 census, which was only there because social reformers pressured the government to include it. Why? Because they wanted to create more and better institutions for what they called lunatics, and they wanted government funding to pay for it. In order to pry that money loose, they needed some hard, cold facts on their side. Enter the 1840 census. That strategy worked. By the year 1890, every single state in the USA had built one or more publicly supported asylums, which sounds good, taking care of people and all that. Sounds like they were doing a much better job of it then than we are now. Not so fast there. Psychiatry was still pretty much in its infancy in the 19th century. There was very little scientific understanding of mental illness at the time. Doctors had a limited grasp on how the human brain even worked. No one knew anything about brain chemistry or how trauma could impact a person's mental health. But they did pay a tremendous amount of attention to social and environmental factors. There were all sorts of things that they believed could cause insanity, starting with heredity. And at least they were right about that one. I mean, we've known for a long time that there are many psychiatric disorders that run in families. Bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, ADHD are just a few. 19th century doctors also loved to blame gender. Guess which one? Social class, environment, and immorality for driving people mad. And that same cluster of variables shaped how people were diagnosed and treated. Which brings us to moron, idiot, imbecile, lunatic, feeble-minded. Insults in our time, but legitimate psychiatric diagnoses back then. Let's consult famed 19th century psychiatrist, Dr. Doc. Start with the diagnosis of moron.
A moron is a person of tragically low intelligence due to a defective family lineage. Such a person boasts a mental age between 8 and 12 years, and thus is trapped forever in the primitive phase of development known as adolescence.
Idiot?
An idiot is a person with a severe intellectual impairment. Such a person requires round-the-clock care as they are simply unable to care for themselves.
How about imbecile?
An imbecile is certainly more intelligent than an idiot, though one cannot expect an imbecile to surpass the abilities of a 7-year-old child. Therefore, we distinguish between mental imbecility, a state of being subnormal, and moral imbecility, which is characterized by an inability to tell right from wrong. The moral imbecile is not only mentally defective, but vicious by nature and inclined to crime. The moral imbecile is also indifferent to punishment.
Lunatic?
A lunatic suffers from an unreliable mind, at times perfectly sound. At other times, the mind of a lunatic is severely disordered. It was once believed that some forms of insanity were caused by the moon, hence the word lunacy. As the moon waxes and wanes, so does the troubled mind of the lunatic.
And, feeble-minded?
The feeble-minded are, of course, mentally defective. What distinguishes the feeble-minded from the idiot or the imbecile is their relatively high level of functioning. Yet the feeble-minded are not productive. In fact, they are a bit backward. As feeble-mindedness is known to be an inherited condition, it is wise to discourage these individuals from reproducing.
Whoa, eugenics much?
I beg your pardon, madam.
Note to self, no one likes a rude time traveler. Sorry, Dr. Doc. So, there was this huge movement to build asylums in the mid-1800s. But that doesn't mean there weren't other places where people with mental illnesses were already housed. It's just that those places were mostly wretched and terrible. Squalid, inhumane madhouses where people would be committed, locked away, and left to die. It didn't take all that much to earn a diagnosis of insanity in the early days of America. A tendency toward melancholy could be enough to do the trick. Difficulty learning, disobeying a husband, not to mention that nearly any behavior could be construed as possession by an evil spirit or demon. Superstition jockeyed with science and won out more often than not. Until about the 1820s, treatments for mental illness reflected the widespread belief that madness was a matter of moral deviance and that the mad could not be reasoned with. The mad, like lions in a circus, had to be tamed. Beatings were a common treatment, along with ice water baths, bloodletting, and restraint. Restraint could be a straitjacket, or ropes, or chains, or a cage. And those cages were narrow and small. Inmates would be locked inside until they were calm, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. And that's if you were lucky enough to be locked up in an actual madhouse. It was just as likely you'd find yourself in jail or a poorhouse. Because remember, back then, insanity was almost synonymous with criminality, and poverty was as much a moral failure as it was an economic one. Everyone knows what a jail is, but a poorhouse? Well, on paper, a poorhouse was a place where the poor could find food and shelter. These places were supposed to be about charity, but in reality, were much, much darker. Many functioned like prisons, filthy prisons where disease ran rampant. That's the shelter part. The food wasn't much, often because the individuals charged with running the poorhouses were caught pocketing the money meant for the poor. People starved in poorhouses. The elderly were often the victims of that greed, which made the asylums of the mid-1800s a paradise in comparison. These were meant to be places where a person might receive compassionate care in a peaceful setting, where a person with mental illness wasn't seen as immoral or evil, but as curable. That was the goal anyway. In practice, the differences between public and private, between people who had money and people who didn't, well, you know from experience how that usually shakes out. Those with money and resources could elect for a private asylum. Cleaner, quieter, far more voluntary, much more spa-like, often in quiet, rural settings designed to help soothe the jangled nerves of the afflicted. Afternoon tea, painting with watercolors on the lawn, a diet of bland food served by white-jacketed attendants, that sort of thing. The poor and those of undesirable race or ethnicity got shipped off to public institutions. They called it long-term custodial care. We call it warehousing. These were patients committed involuntarily, sometimes for legitimate medical reasons like psychosis, sometimes for alcohol use or masturbation or promiscuity or truancy, things that weren't mental health disorders at all. The public institutions were routinely overcrowded and understaffed and relied on harsh and abusive methods just to keep the place under control. And once you were locked in, good luck. The shocking and tragic truth is that once in, you might not see freedom again for decades, if ever. Which brings us to the doors of the State Custodial Asylum for Feeble-Minded Women in Newark, New York. Designed to hold up to 853 inmates with roughly 100 employees. The waiting list was, from the start, a very long one. The place had been operating separately from the children's home for just under 8 years, but was already piling up charges and accusations of mismanagement and cruelty. The state of New York was forced to investigate. Those findings were released on Tuesday, May 2nd, 1893.
Cases of discipline and punishment of considerable variety were narrated by the witnesses. Among them, 3 cases were selected for special mention, as follows. First, the case of Josephine Blessing, being sick with pneumonia and confined to the bed, was, while
in the bed, my clothes were pulled down. I was spanked with a ferrule of hard wood twice in one day. The first time by the second assistant matron, and the second time by the matron. The alleged reason for this violence being my refusal to take the medication prescribed for me. 3 months later, I died.
Josephine Blessing, beaten with a wooden rod while sick with pneumonia.
The case of Teresa Clinton, who, according to the testimony of witnesses, was an invalid, brought by the physician to the matron with the medical advice that the patient was sick, to which advice the matron replied that she knew better, and the patient was only
ugly. The matron called me ugly, whereupon she punished me with the wooden ferrule. Within 1 or 2 days, I was confined to the bed with meningitis. 10 days later, I died.
A pattern was beginning to form.
The case of Mary Moore, confined by straitjacket and a cord tied about her ankles, and in such condition with her clothes pulled up, was
severely and persistently beaten with a wooden ferrule, first by the matron and then by the assistant matron.
Another witness says that a towel or cloth was wound about Mary Moore's head during this operation, but that it did not stifle her screams.
The investigation found that the matron had basically given permission to the assistants to feel free to inflict whatever corporal punishments they felt necessary or useful without getting prior authorization or even reporting it. Then it was revealed that the superintendent of the State Custodial Asylum for Feeble-Minded Women had invented his own special kind of punishment for the patients. Listen to this.
Tripping the patients from behind and letting them fall on their backs. The superintendent claimed that the general method was to clutch the women by the dress around the neck and thus ease their fall to the ground. But it is evident that he sometimes omitted this feature of the performance and suffered the fall to be made without any attempt to break it. It is conceded that there was never any means used to ease the fall or force of contact with the ground, except this garroting or pressure on the throat or neck.
Oh, but there's more.
The proofs also established the fact that sometimes a patient would be thrown to the ground, ordered to her feet, and then thrown again several times in quick succession. The superintendent made clear that these cases of violence were not committed in self-defense of employees or other patients, but were for punishment which he describes as very effective.
Spotty and indifferent record keeping, along with a near complete disregard for the human dignity of these 3 women, means we know very little about how or why they ended up committed to the State Custodial Asylum for Feeble-Minded Women. The official report notes that Teresa Clinton was an epileptic. That is all the information we have. So what were the consequences then for the superintendent, the matron, and all of the other employees accused in the 1893 investigation? The superintendent, Dr. Walter L. Willett, resigned. The matron, Kate R. Willett, wife of the superintendent, resigned. And that's it. You can't even say they resigned in disgrace because there was apparently no disgrace to be found. Still, the show must go on, right? And it did under new management, with new inmates arriving by the day. Lily Patch would eventually become one of those inmates. Born the same year the State Custodial Asylum for Feeble-Minded Women opened for business, Lily found herself at age 18 standing before a magistrate in Saratoga Springs County Court, charged as a common prostitute and a vagrant.
I hereby order you to serve a sentence of no less than 5 years as an inmate of the House of Refuge for Women.
So the House of Refuge for Women in Hudson was the only state prison for women in New York. It was a harsh place known for physical punishment, solitary confinement, and even a dungeon. Like all the inmates, Lily Patch had to sign a document giving the prison authorities permission to open and read her mail, or withhold her mail, and even destroy it as they deemed fit. This was required even though Lily was declared illiterate on her intake paperwork. Illiterate even though she wrote frequent letters to her mother and enjoyed reading and knitting in her little bit of free time. Lily Patch was clearly not a violent or dangerous offender. There were well-intentioned efforts by the prison to release Lily to her mother's care, but the State Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children forcefully blocked that move.
Her mother is the last person to whom Lily should be entrusted.
According to them, Lily's father was guilty of incest, her mother had trafficked the girl, and if that wasn't enough...
The Patch family resides in a tenement building known to rent to thieves and prostitutes and Italians of lower class.
So, no going home for Lily. Instead, she was transferred in 1900 to the State Custodial Asylum for Feeble-Minded Women. You can tell a lot about what kind of era that was, both for women and for mental health, just by reading Lily's application for transfer.
Her face is peculiar and carries her head more than erect.
Wait, back up. What did Lily's appearance have to do with whether or not she should swap one prison cell for another? And how can a head be more than erect? What does that even mean?
Observe also that the inmate suffers from crossed eyes. Regardless of her posture, her shoulders are not symmetrical, giving her a most unsteady appearance. Her speech is affected by some unknown impediment. The inmate has a history of fits.
Okay, so extra erect head, crossed eyes, and asymmetrical shoulders, none of which qualify as a mental illness. The application also notes that Lily was of good temper and had no peculiar or destructive or wanton habits. In fact, while imprisoned at the House of Refuge, Lily's record was almost spotless. A very good girl, to quote one assessment. It was Lily's background that earned her a diagnosis of feeble-minded. Trafficked into prostitution as a child by her own mother, according to the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. By age 16, Lily had contracted syphilis and given birth to a child. Her particular form of insanity, according to the professionals, was
promiscuity, the influence of which can only be described as evil. A young girl facing a hopeless struggle for moral preservation. Such corruption cannot help but pollute body, mind, and spirit.
Page after page, and it's a pure wonder that her file even survived the passage of years. Her application ended with this summary.
The girl is feeble-minded. The only history I can obtain is by questioning the girl herself, and her statements cannot be relied upon.
And so, Lily Patch entered the State Custodial Asylum for Feeble-Minded Women in Newark, New York, in January 1901. Not only were her statements deemed unreliable, apparently the authorities thought she couldn't be trusted to read her own mail. Though she, like all inmates, had been compelled to sign away all the rights to her mail, there seems no reason beyond cruelty why letters from her sister were confiscated. And why they thought those letters might be triggering is extra confusing, given the way they insisted that Lily was illiterate. Lily had been at Newark for 6 months when her sister wrote a letter to the superintendent expressing how worried she was about Lily, about how no one had heard from Lily in far too long.
Dear Madam, will you please tell me where Miss Lily Patch is? She is my sister, and I have not heard from her in a long time. Mother got a letter from her, and she gave her address as Newark, and Mother sent it to her, and it came back unopened. And Mother is dead now and buried, and she said for me to look after Lily. So please let me know as soon as possible.
The letter was signed in the sister's married name of Coleman. She included her address. She never received a response, which might have been a response in itself. There was a cemetery at the State Custodial Asylum for Feeble-Minded Women. Buried there were women whose bodies went unclaimed by relatives. Women were buried in anonymous, unmarked graves. But let's be slow to judge those families for not showing up to claim their loved ones. Many, if not most of the inmates, came from impoverished backgrounds. These were women who'd been scooped up by the state as children, sent to almshouses, it's another word for poorhouse, prisons, and institutions like this one. What ties they had to family or community were severed. Like in the case of Lily Patch, who had family trying to find her. An effort that was ignored. And why not? Who cared what became of yet one more lost girl? Wasn't it for the best that her hopeless story ended with her? That no poor innocent child was forced to carry the stain of its mother's legacy? Oh, God. When you're able to find even one moment in human history where women and the bodies of women weren't considered fair game for the state, do please let us know. Anyway, here's where it gets really dark for the women incarcerated at the State Custodial Asylum for Feeble-Minded Women. For them, and for every
inmate of New York State hospitals for the insane, state prisons, reformatories, and charitable institutions, rapists, and confirmed criminals in penal institutions.
Oh, a state law was approved on April 16th, 1912, allowing forced sterilization based on principles of eugenics. Candidates for the procedure were to be selected by
decision by majority of board after examining mental and physical condition of the subject, his record and family history, of the improbability of improvement of his condition, and the consequent inadvisability of procreation, or of the probability of substantial improvement of the subject's condition thereby.
A year later, the data was presented at the New York State Conference of Charities and Correction.
We estimate there are 30,000 feeble-minded in the state. About 5,000 are cared for in institutions designed for them. About 10,000 are confined in institutions not intended for their care. About 15,000, or half the total number of feeble-minded, are at large in the community.
Feeble-minded at large, the kind of phrase generally reserved for dangerous criminals.
The feeble-minded are, of course, mentally defective. What distinguishes the feeble-minded from the idiot or the imbecile is their relatively high level of functioning. Yet the feeble-minded are not productive. In fact, they are a bit backward. As feeble-mindedness is known to be an inherited condition, it is wise to discourage these individuals from reproducing.
Of the 30,000 feeble-minded in New York, 10,000 are women and girls of childbearing age.
At least 160 of those girls were incarcerated at the Syracuse State Institution for Feeble-Minded Children. 800 of those women were locked up with Lily Patch at Newark. The rest were scattered among the state's other hospitals, prisons, and poorhouses. But it wasn't just the incarcerated feeble-minded that the state had its eyes on.
That does leave 15,000 feeble-minded for whom no public provision has been made. Thousands of poor mothers are giving up their lives largely to the care of feeble-minded children. But these mothers are unable to prevent them from becoming a menace to the community.
Okay, here it comes. Not just the forced sterilization of girls and women in custody.
In the long run, it would be far more economical for the community to separate them in institutions institutions than to allow them to remain in the homes, only to become ultimately paupers, criminals, prostitutes, or parents of children like themselves.
They were really gunning for this population that was basically made up, with a diagnosis so vague that it was more opinion than anything approaching a medical or scientific fact.
It is the popular superstition in the community that the insane are dangerous while the feeble-minded are harmless. We are learning at last that the feeble-minded boy and girl are 3 times more of a menace to the community than the senile and the mild chronic insane in our hospitals.
Buddy, 3 times more dangerous? You just pulled that right out of thin air. What are you talking about?
Moreover, the feeble-minded girl is vastly more dangerous to the community than the feeble-minded boy. The reason for this statement is that the heredity of feeble-mindedness, for the most part, comes from the feeble-minded girl. Not only is this true, but investigations made in New Jersey have demonstrated that the feeble-minded woman is twice as prolific as the normal woman. This arises partly from the fact that the feeble-minded woman is unable to protect herself, and partly for the fact that she is not afflicted by the moral restraints or the regard for consequences which restrain the normal woman.
New York was the 8th state in the U.S. to pass a sterilization law. It stayed on the books for 6 years until being declared unconstitutional in March 1918, and then was repealed in May 1920. I guess we have the slow pace of bureaucracy to thank for the fact that the state only got around to forcibly sterilizing 42 people. Of that number, 41 were women. It's a safe bet that Lily Patch wasn't one of them. None of the women sterilized were incarcerated at the Newark facility. But it's a real possibility, an unhappy possibility, that Lily's was one of the nearly 6,000 bodies buried in anonymous graves at the State Custodial Asylum for Feeble-Minded Women in Newark. The asylum changed its name in 1916 to the Newark State School for Mental Defectives, which somehow sounds worse, though it was actually ahead of its time. The diagnostic category of feeble-mindedness was less and less in public view by the 1930s. The U.S. Census kept up, using mental defectives in its 1932 report instead of feeble-minded. In 1934, the American Association for the Study of Feeble-Mindedness changed its name to the American Association on Mental Deficiency, and that name stuck right up through 1985. Today, the Newark State School for Mental Defectives is mostly abandoned. The long, unused buildings are decrepit and condemned. If you're picturing some Gothic pile deep in the forest, think again. It's surrounded by working businesses. Busted windows with rusted-out metal frames stare blankly at lush green grass and neatly parked cars and minivans and trucks. The cemetery's still there, too. What used to be a forgotten and overgrown tangle has been cleaned up by former staffers and folks who live nearby. An Eagle Scout named Tucker Crawford and his dad put in 300 hours worth of work on the place. They've all done what they can to give a little dignity to the souls that are buried there. Women made invisible while they lived and then erased after they died. People do say the place is haunted, that inexplicable sounds can be heard, images flickering at the corner of your vision, a heaviness in the air. And why wouldn't there be? So many of the former inmates are still right there, lying in graves marked only by a number. The suitcases they arrived with were found crammed in an attic. Their liberty was stolen. Their names were forgotten. And all that's left now is the outline of a person, A young woman severed from her past, denied her future, trapped forever in the place where she'd lived as a captive and died as a number. What else can you call that but a ghost? Next time on True Weird Stuff, what happens when a banker obsessed with ancient hallucinogenic mushroom rituals gets tangled up with the CIA? The birth of the psychedelic age in America, that's what. Meet the granddaddy of shrooms on the next True Weird Stuff.
Special thanks to our voice talents on this episode: Heather Elizabeth, Carrie Doc Bowser, Don Morgan, Bridget Goolsby, Beth Latino, Sherry Wellman, and Stuart Watson. And apologies if there's no discussion at the end of this episode. There was a technical problem. We hope to have that for you sometime in the future. And if you listen to us on Apple Podcasts, hit the plus button in the top right corner, and now it helps an independent podcast like ours to get discovered. And we really appreciate it if you subscribe, rate, and review True Weird Stuff.
Hit our website, trueweirdstuff.com, for show notes and photos and videos when we have it, and bonus content. Everything True Weird is waiting for you at trueweirdstuff.com.
And follow True Weird Stuff on Instagram.
True Weird Stuff is a Now Media production. Our executive producer is Anthony Garcia. The show is written and hosted by me, Sherry Lynch, along with my deeply weird director, Max Sweeten. Our equally odd producer is Carrie Bowser. Additional production by the mysterious Stephen Call. Our digital witch and social media cult leader is Heather Furr. Original graphics by Kevin Nash. Original artworks by Olivia Axlin. True Weird original music composed and performed by Jack Griffin and Zane Nash. Copyright 2024 Now Media. All rights reserved. All wrongs remembered.